Há 6 anos atrás, o senhor esteve no Brasil falando sobre uma importante pesquisa feita em Cuba.
Sim.
Eu gostaria que o senhor falasse um pouco sobre essa pesquisa e se houve alguma mudança daqueles resultados de lá para cá. Nesse momento se constata mudanças do que o senhor constatou naquele momento.
Yes, the main reason to talk, the main reason I compared Cuba with Brazil and Chile, and with other Latin American countries, but I focused in that study on Cuba, I focused on 3 countries really. 3 countries with quite different educational systems. That is, Brazil with a federal system, quite decentralized with municipal schools and state schools even within the same state. Chile with an ostensibly decentralized system because it's highly privatized, but in fact quite a lot of control from the center, but privatized. And Cuba, not privatized and with a lot and very centralized, okay, with lots of control. And so that's why I focused on those 3 countries. And we went into classrooms, we interviewed policymakers, and we used empirical data that's available from the, at that time, the IESE, which is now the CERCE and now the TERCE. Every 7 years, UNESCO gives a test to primary school students. So it's about primary school. So I compared the primary school teaching in mathematics, and I don't say it's a causal study. It's just a descriptive study, but we learned a lot from that. And you asked me whether I saw a change in Brazil, for example, because of that book and because of looking outside and trying to see what we can bring in. And frankly, in the key areas, I don't think there's a change in Brazil. No, I think there are other changes, but not the kind of changes that I think you can bring from Cuba. So what are those changes? You can't bring the system. The system has 2 aspects to it that cannot be imported into Brazil. Number 1, you have a strong Communist Party mechanism that supervises all public services, and very strongly supervises, the same as China. It's a highly supervised system. So teachers are supervised, principals are supervised, everybody's highly supervised. And to tell you the truth, it works. High control, I believe, is better. I mean, the standard idea about education is to give teachers autonomy and let them be creative in the classroom. That's the idea. And it works in a system where the teachers are extremely highly trained. The parents have a very clear picture of what they want their kids to learn, and you still have state accountability. You still have accountability from the state, but you can leave a lot of, and you have excellent principals who can work with the teachers to improve. If you have all of that, autonomy is great. In the situation of a Latin American country, autonomy is not so great, because what do you get with autonomy? You get absenteeism, you get very big variation in the quality of teaching in the schools. You have some very good teachers and many not so good teachers, and they do what they want. Even the academic supervisor in Brazil doesn't go into the classrooms very often, if at all. So, and also with a lot of autonomy, you have if you have really excellent pre-service training, like in Cuba, you could give more autonomy, but they do give autonomy after 3 or 4 years. They give quite a bit of autonomy. So in Brazil, what I said the thing to do is to import is, number 1, much more relationship between the teacher education system and the schools. In other words, teachers should be prepared to be great teachers in the schools. And in order to do that, you have to really set high standards and not give control to the universities of how to prepare teachers. So that's number 1, that you could import that. You can't import the fact that Cuba pays everybody the same salaries until now. Now it's changing.
No, but change.
Well, not completely. In certain places where there's a lot of tourism, it's changing. But still, most teachers in Cuba receive very little money, as do most doctors, etc. So people don't choose their professions on the basis of salary. They choose their professions largely on what they are good at and what they want to do. Mostly, the state still decides what you do. But in any way, if you're not a very good teacher, you won't be teaching very long. Okay, so you can't import that. In Brazil, teachers get paid very little compared to other professionals on average. So you're going to get people going into teaching that either are idealistic, it's like the United States, or they simply are not that good at anything else. And since most teachers are women, it depends very much on the labor market in the particular area where they go to school, because most teachers come from local labor market. They don't travel to teach very far. So you can't import the idea of recruiting a whole new class of people into the teaching force. So where could you make change? In two areas. Number one, you can make change in much better teacher education to prepare the teachers better, and we know how to do that, but you definitely have to, you cannot let universities dictate how to train teachers. You can't do that. We have the same problem in the United States. The second thing is that you must have much more control over what goes on in schools, okay, in the Brazilian situation. So you can import those two things. Now, it can't be like Cuba, where the Communist Party runs it, but you can have, for example, in Brazil, you have a tremendous disadvantage. You have each municipality up to really middle school, although middle school, there's some state schools, each municipality has control over its schools. The state doesn't even have control over those municipal schools. And then the state has a separate system. Now almost all the primary schools are in municipal schools. Then there's a mix, in the middle. And then the state has the high schools, the secundaria, ensino medio. So the children are coming from schools that the state doesn't control.
Yeah.
Okay.
Right.
It's great if you have this wonderful teaching force and you have this wonderful curriculum that, but you don't. So in a way it depends completely on local administrators, or in the case of the state schools, the state administrators. And they have a big effect, we think, by looking at differences between the states in Brazil and municipal schools in Brazil. So you can do those two things. Better preparation of teachers, more accountability, okay?
Mas para isso, você precisa acompanhar o que se passa dentro da sala de aula.
In a way, that's true, but I would say that you should start by figuring out what the states should do, and then how you implement this in the sala de aula. But first you have to start with, what do you want to do at the state level? So now there's a big discussion in Brazil, for example, about a common curriculum for the whole country. Cuba has a common curriculum. Chile has a common curriculum, by the way, for each grade. That's probably a good thing, except here's the problem with a common curriculum. It's one thing to say we're going to have a common curriculum, and another thing to get people to teach that common curriculum. That, if you have a highly decentralized system, you have enormous variation of how that's implemented, okay? So how do you assure that teachers actually do this? We measure SAEB scores, and I can tell you that one of the most important variables in determining what the SAEB score is of a student is how much of the curriculum the teacher has covered in the class by the teacher's own admission. So the question is for the teachers, how much have you covered the curriculum? And it varies a lot. And it's very, very important. If they cover more than 80% of the curriculum, the student score is much higher in those classrooms, controlling for many other things. Knows their age, their gender, their social class. That has a big effect, okay? So it's really, opportunity to learn is really important. So how do you get that to happen? In Cuba, it happens through the Communist Party making sure that principals do what they're supposed to do, that the teachers do what they're supposed to do, and Cuba has also the link between their universities, their pedagogical universities, they have pedagogical universities, and they train the teachers there. But that training is completely controlled by the state. They are interested in making good teachers.
É um autoritarismo
Beneficial. In this case,
positivo, é isso?
In this case, very good for kids. Authoritarianism is, in this case, very good for kids, not very good for adults. Not very good for adults, but very good for kids. Kids are guaranteed food, health care, excellent schooling, and no violence, because everybody's watching everybody else. Okay, so you have not only a sense of collectivity, but an enforced sense of collectivity. If a parent does not send their child to school for 2 or 3 days in a row, a teacher goes to the family. If the family doesn't respond, the party secretary goes to the family.
Nossa.
Their jobs are at stake because they're employed by the state. So there's no, kids are protected, you know. Now, there's some things that you might object to, what they do with the kids, but in general, a poor kid in Cuba doesn't have to worry about violence, doesn't have to worry about making bad choices in life, because they don't have choices, you know. In Brazil, kids have a lot of choices. The poor kids are often making very bad choices. They don't have that option in Brazil, okay? You have if the family doesn't take care of it, the state will take care of it. But I think it's a very interesting discussion. Is that bad or good? I think most of us agree that we don't want to live in a society, an authoritarian society, where we're told what to do as adults. But I'm not sure that it's so bad to control what happens to kids. And the same thing goes for the education system. In Brazil, the kind of education that kids get depend very much on who their parents are. Okay?
The parents.
The parent, who they are.
Mas como consegue aprender, consegue compreender o que se passa na sala de aula e acompanhar, ter um bom desenvolvimento dentro da escola, alguém que não tem casa, que não tem afeto, que não tem comida, onde falta tudo. Como que essa pessoa...
I have to say that Brazil in the last 15 years with the Bolsa Família has really improved the conditions of the extreme poor and the poor. I mean, I think that's true. I've seen it from income distribution figures, and I've seen it from consumption figures. The poor have definitely benefited from that. So the conditions of the kids who were poor have improved in Brazil. The middle class, not so sure, but the poor definitely have come up. So some of the conditions. In Cuba, of course, the thing is even more compressed. So a poor child is guaranteed everything, health care, schooling, and nutrition, just guaranteed, okay? There's nobody really poor in Cuba, even in the rural areas. Everybody's taken care of. And of course, it's a much smaller population, so it's easier to do, but Cuba's much poorer as a country than Brazil. So, of course, helping children live in less poverty can have a big effect on their educational possibilities. But the next part is, who is teaching them? How is that person prepared? How much is that person ready to deal with the issues in the classroom?
O senhor está dizendo aqui que é importante o professor aprender a ensinar.
Exatamente.
É isso. E quais são as obrigações e os direitos desse professor?
The first problem is, what is the obligation of the state to prepare these professors before they send them into the schools? Because this is a problem. To send people into the schools who are not really well prepared is right away, particularly particularly since the state claims responsibility for the education system, not for the whole education system, but certainly for the basic education system up to, let's say, 8th or 9th grade. So when I say the state, I mean the public sector. So what is that responsibility? Well, they basically said, we're going to turn over the preparation of teachers to universities, okay? So on the one hand, only 25% of the students are going to public universities in Brazil. And then another 75%, even in pedagogia, are going to private universities. Now, the federal government controls those private universities. So theoretically, the federal government could force private universities to do teacher training in a particular way or not give them accreditation. They could do that. There are state universities which are controlled by the states. Each state could force the state universities could set standards, very high standards for teacher education. So what is missing in the Brazilian case? The Brazilian case separates what goes on in the university from the practice of what goes on in schools. They train teachers as if they were training economists who will learn then everything they really need to know about economics in their jobs. Okay? Imagine that so we're training teachers in a way that's completely divorced from what they're going to have to do in schools. So if you go to a good public university, USP, for example, and you say, USP doesn't train many teachers, even though in their teacher training program, but let's say you go to Federal de Goiás. So you go to Federal de Goiás, and you say, well, what are you doing here to train the teachers? So they say, oh, they have to do their, they have to go to the schools to do their prática, So what does this prática mean? They go for a few months to the school, and then they practice teaching, usually unsupervised, by the way. The people from the schools don't come to the university. They don't come to the university to tell the university, well, listen, you're not preparing the teachers very well to teach in our schools. They come completely unprepared, And so there's no relationship, no ligação, in between the two things. In Cuba, the way it's done, and in the best programs in the United States, is that the university basically sends the teachers to the school for a year, and while they're in this process of teaching for a year, they are supervised by people. They do a partnership between the university and the schools, wherever schools the young teachers go to, the teachers to be, and then they come back to the university and discuss with their professors what they're doing in the schools, and you have supervisors from the schools who also come to those discussions. So the preparation is in the reality of the schools. And the idea is to really train teachers how to be good teachers, not to train them in the theory of justice or to talk about, they can talk about Teixeira, they can talk about Paulo Freire, there's nothing wrong with it. They should talk about those philosophers, but they also have to learn how to teach, to teach. And this is what's absent in Brazil. There's no responsibility of the university to train teachers, and no university professor wants to be seen as a vocational educator. They don't want to be saying, oh, I'm training people to be better mechanics. I'm not interested in really what it takes to make someone stand in front of a classroom and be able to deliver this curriculum. When we interviewed in Chile, in Faculdades de Educação, you know what the students told us? In front of the ministries, in front of people from the ministry, they said, we know the theory, the so-called theory of education. We know the theory of literature. Let's say they're doing Spanish literature. We know the theory of each, only we don't know how to teach it. We don't know how to teach literature. It's the only thing they didn't train us to do.
Nossa, e como foi a recepção do resultado dessa pesquisa que o senhor fez e que parece que tão duradouro o resultado?
It is so difficult to change universities.
É.
Now, you would think that some private universities, because there are many of them in Brazil, would get the idea that we could attract people who want to go into teaching by making the best teacher training programs that really work to help teachers do teaching. But they don't. They don't know how to do it. Nobody flies to Cuba and see how they do it, or nobody comes to the best program. We are bringing people to Stanford to try to train them to do it, okay? We show them how to do it at Stanford because we have one of the best teacher education programs in the world, and we try to train them to do it. But then they try to come back to Brazil, and nobody wants to do it because it takes a lot of effort, takes a lot of investment. You have to, first of all, have partner schools. You have to have schools that want to work with you. Okay, not just to take some apprentices. The schools really have to do something.
Mr. Carnoy, como o senhor vê o futuro de um país, de uma geração como o Brasil, onde cada vez mais você não encontra pessoas, ou você encontra pessoas que falem, eu quero ser professor. Não querem, você não vê o jovem querendo ser professor como um ideal de profissão.
Well, the worst thing is that they know that if they become teachers, they will be sent. It's like saying to soldiers, I'm going to train you to go into battle for a few weeks, and then if you can survive the first week, you'll be a good soldier. If you can survive the first 2 or 3 years in teaching, maybe you'll be a good teacher. But it's like sending people. And most teachers end up teaching students in Brazil who don't come to school very well prepared, who are difficult to teach, because that's the majority of the population in schools. So at least we should prepare them to do this. It's terrible to work in a job that you're not prepared. Nobody supervises you either. It's the least supervised industry in the world. You have one supervisor for 20 or 30 teachers. Who ever heard of such a thing? You know, but it's true everywhere, by the way. So we don't train the supervisors either, by the way. So we don't even train the supervisors how to do this. We elect them, or, you know, sometimes they're good, sometimes they're not good. Anyway, there are ways to solve this.
Qual o principal desafio para quem quer melhorar a formação do professor?
We know how to do it. We know how to do it. It isn't like we don't have to invent we don't have to invent the hydrogen bomb. We don't have to figure out how to get to Mars. We know how to do this. There are great teacher education institutions in the world, all over the world, that do this in many countries. And it's quite simple to do. It requires investment, it requires long-term, it's not a quick fix. It will require modeling for it. We're trying to do it. Little Stanford is trying to do it now with Brazil. Perhaps we'll be lucky and we'll find some places that will do it, then we can show other Brazilians how to do it. It can be done. It requires a lot of work.
Vamos sonhar aqui juntos. Se o Brasil tivesse feito mudanças nos últimos 10 anos, conseguido conquistar boas mudanças para esse ambiente do aprendizado, como é que nós estaríamos hoje?
I tell you where there's been progress in Brazil. There has been progress. And I'll tell you where it has come. Some states have figured out that by simply making some interventions.
Localizadas.
Yeah, but the state working with the municipalities or the state working with the state schools, they figure if they just pay attention to what's going on in the schools and train people how to do some interventions. For example, Ceará. Ceará used a model in Sobral to make for the whole state. And you can see what happened to the SAEB scores in Ceará. Both municipal schools and state schools went way up. So you had a literacy intervention, but more than that, You had the state training teachers to use these materials, quite good materials, and gave a sense to people in the state, that both municipalities and the state, that education was really important and the state was paying attention. They were giving incentives, they were giving training, they were giving good material. So they did this, and it works. It works. It's not difficult to do it. We have states in the United States that have made enormous gains in mathematics. Enormous.
Yeah.
Doing the same thing.
Yeah?
Yeah. Massachusetts compared to Connecticut in the last 10 years. Huge difference by doing the same kind of thing. Strong curriculum, teacher training, in-service training, and going into those districts and municipalities like in Ceará and working with them to improve.
E quando se faz essas mudanças, demora quanto tempo para
Não muito tempo.
Colher os resultados?
10 years.
10 years.
10 years, not much. Not much. By the way, all of Brazil has gone up in SAEB in the last 10 years. But some states, the top states, the ones who have made the biggest gains, for example, in mathematics, in 8th grade mathematics, have gone up 20 points more than the lower states. 20 points. It's a lot on SAEB. It's a half a standard deviation. It's really big. So the difference between the top states and the bottom states. Same in the U.S., by the way. Big difference between the top 10 states and the bottom 10 states in terms of change. We pretty much know what to do. It requires, it helps to have continuous administration. It helps not to have one governor decide that he wants to completely change the education system because of the other government. This is happening now in Minas Gerais. It's not, I don't think it's very smart. PT came in and all of a sudden they want to say, oh, what the previous government did was bad. It's not true. Previous government did good things in Minas Gerais. Test scores in Minas Gerais went way up. So it just, political stuff you should forget, and you should just think about what do we know how to do, and let's do it. So we're trying to work with this Secretaria de Educação in states that want to work with us and to help them to do these things. The good thing in Brazil, we have lots of data, so we can really analyze what is happening. And we sort of know already what some interventions work, what seems to work to make gains. But you're right about you need a combination of lifting the kids to make them better with better nutrition, better, healthier, have them not be hungry and sick. So you need to do that. That's very important. That's about 60% of what you have to do.
60%.
Yeah, 60%. And then the other 40%, you can make improvements in part of the improvement in Brazil's test scores have been because of, I think, because of Bolsa Família was Bolsa Escolar, but Bolsa Escola was called, right?
No passado.
Originally, in Brazil, it was the first.
Yeah.
Yeah.
No governo Fernando Henrique.
Yeah. So I think that helped. I think it helped a lot because it's the lower scores that are coming up the most, by the way.
Agora, como tem sido a repercussão quando o senhor chega para um administrador, um gestor público e diz dessas constatações que o senhor fez?
I tell you, I talked with the governor of Goiás in August. We met with the governor of Goiás.
Sim.
And I told him he wants to do charter schools. He wants everything charter schools. You know what charter schools are?
Charter schools?
Charter schools. He wants to turn over the schools to foundations to run, like Fundação.
Instituto Ayrton Senna.
Yeah, they run schools, that they have their schools. So he realized that you can't do it for the whole state, so he's going to do it in one poor area of the state next to Brasilia. He'll do it. So they're going to take all the schools in that area and turn it over to some fundação. I don't know which one. And I think, by the way, that it could improve the schools somewhat to do that.
É?
But for a small group of schools, and the lowest schools, with a very good fundação, because there are many fundações that don't know what they're doing. So that will work. But I told them, I said, look, other states are intervening much more with the municipalities and helping them, taking leadership with the municipalities to help them. And he understood it immediately. He understood it immediately. He realized that the state controls mostly secondary schools and middle schools. And if you don't do something about the primary schools, you're basically, you're tied with one arm behind your back with the high schools. You're really trying to overcome deficits that should have been overcome before. So for example, we also know that preschool education is very important. Pré-escolar.
Ah, sim.
Pré-escolar is very important. But I mean, pré-escolar means pre-kindergarten.
Mas olha, o senhor fala de pré-escolar, imagina só. São Paulo, hoje, notícia recebi agora, existe uma fila de 152 mil crianças esperando vaga.
Cada vaga.
Esperando vaga. Sabe, o tempo médio de espera para eles conseguirem em São Paulo, 840 dias.
Well, you know, you're in a recession now, so I doubt you're going to start investing in pré-escolar. But when things get better, it should be important investment. It should be an important investment. Now, you know, when I tell you these things as a North American, I'm ashamed to say that we're much richer than Brazil.
Yeah.
And we don't invest in pré-escolar, even when everybody understands how important it is. Obama tried to get a early childhood education bill passed, went nowhere.
Tem um outro dado, professor Carnoy, que eu li outro dia sobre os estudantes já no nível universitário aqui nos Estados Unidos. De cada 10 estudantes, 7 saem com dívida, com o dinheiro que pegaram emprestado para manter a sua vida universitária.
Is it a good investment or not? That's the question.
É.
I mean, also you could argue that people buy homes mainly through mortgages, hipotecas. So is that a good thing to do or not? Should you wait until you have the money to buy a home? We don't do that. You borrow money to buy a house. You borrow as much as you can. Now, the problem, I don't think, is so much with the debt that to take student loans. I think the problem is more the interest rates that they pay. Because the interest rates in the United States now are very low. If I take a loan on my house, I can borrow for 3%. Okay? Well, 3% is low interest. A student has to pay, not every student, depends on how much you earn, but a normal student pays 6 or 7%.
Nossa.
Okay, now you think, oh, it's high risk if you lend to an individual student, because at least with a house, the bank can have the house if you don't pay.
Yeah.
But, and it's true, that a student that doesn't end up working is a risk if you lend the money. But if the student works, the government in the United States has the right to deduct the payment from their salary. So what's the risk? There's no risk. So why are they paying such high interest rate? So I think the problem is the high interest rate. So and many low-income students should be receiving more scholarships. So there's a shortage of scholarships for the poor and the high interest rates for the middle class. Those are the two problems. To invest in education is still a good investment. So I would never advise someone not to borrow money and not go to university right now. I would never do that. But I would say if you can, borrow the money through your parents if they can borrow the money on their house. So take more debt on your house use it to pay for university, and then you'll only pay half the interest. Then it becomes good. It's a good investment at half the interest. So it's really the interest rate which is the problem, and the fact that many poor people feel uncomfortable borrowing so much money because they've never thought about borrowing so much money. So they should get more, there should be more scholarship money.
Quanto que o governo deveria prover de escola pública para os seus habitantes? Quanto? Deveria ser coberto totalmente do ensino da pré-escola à universidade? Deveria.
It's a big debate. It's a big debate. We are having this debate now in the United States again. Part of the problem is that right now in the United States, only about, I would say, 20 to 25% of all students who go to four-year universities, not community colleges with only 2 years, but go to four-year universities, go to private schools. Most go to public universities. So if you stay within your state, you pay tuition. In California, it's $12,000 at the University of California. At the state university, it's only $3,500 per year. Not expensive.
No.
Okay. In Michigan, I think it's $14,000. Wisconsin, $14,000 per year. So tuition at public universities is substantial, but not very high. Okay. So I would say that there's plenty of opportunity to take a university education at a reasonable price in the United States. Now in Brazil, you have a different kind of problem, because in Brazil, you have two problems. Number one, the government has basically always in history allowed most universities to be private. Even in the 1960s, 60% of students, when the expansion of the 1960s, the first expansion, 60% by the end of the 1960s went to private universities, okay? And now it's about 72 or 73%, maybe 7, in certain fields more. So you have, I would say it's a little bit imbalanced. The other problem in Brazil is such a high percentage of the private universities are for profit. And I don't think that's a healthy development, because even the nonprofits are worried about their costs too much. And so they do a lot of things to lower costs rather than, it's easier to lower costs than increase productivity. And it's even worse in the for-profits. The for-profits are going to focus almost entirely on keeping costs down rather than increasing productivity, because it's not easy to increase productivity. So that's a big problem in Brazil. The other problem is that in both sets of universities, a very small fraction of the people going to universities come from the bottom 40% of income. Very small. It's probably 10% in both, a little bit more in public. So most of the people who go to universities about half come from the upper 20%. So the question is this: it's true that having private universities at least makes that group pay. It's like a tax, a user tax. You're using university, you pay. But another group of them, a smaller group of them, about 25% to maybe, let's say, 30%, don't pay anything. Okay? Okay. Now they can argue that they pay more taxes, so therefore they shouldn't pay. But the taxes they pay maybe aren't that high, okay? Although it was claimed today that the tax burden is very great. The question is, why don't the public universities at least charge those students, from 10 minimum wages up? Why don't they charge them something, $10,000 a year or something, which is what a lot of them would easily pay in private universities if they attended. So I'm not saying to charge them a huge amount of money, but at least charge them something as a form of a tax. So if they went, particularly if they went to a private school for secondary school, they should just continue to pay. So there's that debate also.
O que o senhor acha das políticas públicas de incentivo ao professor, que inclui a meritocracia, aumento de salário relacionado com o resultado, a produtividade, notas de alunos?
There's a very similar debate in the United States. Very similar. Oh yeah, completely the same debate. So the question is this. Economists believe that by paying incentives, and by the way, Jorge Paulo Lemann believes that by making an important part of your salary an incentive, a bonus, that you will get people to work harder, okay? And I think the data indicate that certainly in a place like Brazil, where there's a lot of absenteeism among teachers and a lot of not very great effort to watch in the classroom, that you see in the classroom, there are some cases, some studies, which show, like in Pernambuco, it's a good study by Ferraz, that show that these incentives have some effect on productivity of the teachers, that students do better with those teachers. Now, there are other studies that show that it has very little effect, okay? Even in the United States, there's some studies that show it has an effect, other studies don't. Now, in the US, our teachers are much better prepared. Absenteeism is a minimal problem, okay? And besides, every teacher must hire a substitute if they don't show up. You have to have a substitute teacher. So, I mean, students are covered. But in Brazil, not. So the question of how much effort a teacher will put out based on incentives is a reasonable question in a country where you could argue that the average effort is below what it should be. That's one issue. But the other issue is problematic, is that very often the best teachers are assigned, in the United States, are assigned the most problematic classes. They volunteer to do that, okay? And that's a good thing. We want that to happen, right? We want that to happen. We want the best teachers also to help the students who aren't doing so well. So a teacher that can really do well in the class, control the class, manage the class, you want them to. But their value added, how much the students will learn in that class, is probably not as great as another class. So it's going to disincentivize teachers from taking those difficult classes, right? If I'm a teacher and I'm going to be paid on the basis of how well my class does, I'm going to try to game the system by choosing the good classes, the ones that are going to make more progress. So that's a big problem. The other problem is that the tests that are used to evaluate what the gains are often not really related strongly to what the teacher assumes they're supposed to be teaching, okay? So the other condition is that you have to have a strong relationship of the test that you're using to the actual curriculum and standards that the teacher knows that they're supposed to be teaching, okay? That's the second thing. The third thing is that you often don't measure a lot of other things that the teacher does effectively. And the fourth problem is that many teachers cannot respond to those incentives because they don't know how. So if you want that kind of incentive system, you also owe it to the teachers to provide the technical support to teach them how to teach better. Simply saying, I'm going to pay you more if you do this and this is not enough if the person doesn't know how to improve. If the person has never learned, it all assumes that effort is the problem rather than knowledge and capacity, okay? Now, unless you're willing to throw out in Brazil probably 1/3 of your teachers, how are you going to replace them? You know, if you're going to, so you're going to demoralize the teachers who are working hard but don't know how to do better. You're going to completely demoralize them. Okay. Now, it's very nice if you're running a company and you're paying high salaries and you can simply replace people who aren't as productive as you want them to be with new people who are going to be more productive. But that's not true in the educational system. If you're paying low salaries, as you said, you're getting people to come into the system, many of them because they don't know what else to do. So they come in to teach. And then you don't provide them with any support, and you're going to say, oh, we're going to pay you on base of productivity. So you're probably going to lose a lot of people right away. They're going to do something else. You're going to frustrate some people. And the other problem is you're going to disincentivize teachers from taking the difficult classes. So there are lots of problems with that, even if it works. Even if it works for some teachers, you know. Anyway, I'm not saying teachers' incentives can't do some, teacher pay incentives can't do some things. But first of all, the incentive system has to be a particular kind of incentive system. It's very important how you put this in place. And it's very important that you understand that you got to have a whole investment behind it to try to help people to respond to it.
Muito obrigada, professor. Okay.